So we have to understand the things that we see and the preconceived notions, those biases we have, might affect what we're doing, and our own actions might be a result of bias. So it's important to just check yourself. I used to teach entry-level paramedics, and I always told them nobody dies in 30 seconds, so you always have time to take a breath and give it some thought. So let's talk about the next one, which is anchoring bias. This is a tendency that we have to rely too heavily on the very first piece of information we learned, whether it's what we saw when we walked onto a scene, the very first picture we were shown, the very first impression we got from a phone call. I can't call him a colleague, but a friend of mine calls it Wisey-addy or Wizzy-addy. What you see is all it is. But it's not necessarily that case. We tend to put on the blinders. I mean, how many of you, and the old saying is you can't judge a book by its cover. And in fact, a lot of those old anecdotal sayings are meant to overcome a bias. So judging a book by its cover. But how many of you have watched a movie trailer and thought, okay, I'm going to put out the cash and go to that movie. Now we have to either rent or stream or whatever because going to a movie theater is a bit problematic. And we're sorely disappointed. Or you bought a magazine, you spent $10 and bought that magazine off the rack because the cover was awesome, but then you were sorely disappointed. Now, if that disappointment is found by an impression you got from something, what about in your everyday job? I talked to a Baptist minister friend of mine, and he said an example might be somebody might walk into the office and they were talking about the music and the music presentation, and they really don't like it anymore. And now first impression might be to go speak to whoever coordinates the music. But listen, ask some pointed questions, get the whole story, and you might find out that the person who was the previous music director, who was one of the people, was a close, intimate friend, and they've now left. And that's really what the person is upset about. But to put it into another idea, what if a person shows up at a job interview and they were nervous, they didn't sleep very well, they stutter and stammer throughout it, but you ignored their resume and you ignored a lot of things, and you may have had this first impression of them when they come into the room and their very first answers they give, and you tend to not listen to the excellent answers they give to some other very behavioral based questions that would make them an ideal candidate. Another thing I've seen is OHS professionals who are at their desk and they listen to the phone call and then they say, well, email me a few pictures, and that's how they do their report, is based on a few pictures or what they immediately saw.
How could I have been so stupid?
Think of how you could be so wrong about an inspection, a hazard assessment, an investigation, etc. You have to go to the scene. But beyond that, you have to gather all of your data. So look at everything, understand everything, read the reports, but also talk to people. But beyond talking to people, ask the proper questions and listen. I always used to say, if you're not getting the right answers, did you ask the right questions? Don't draw your conclusions from the scene. That's the worst thing that you could do. Whether it be an inspection, an investigation, draw your conclusions after you've done an incident timeline, after you've had the chance to review all of the data. Then make your conclusions. It happens time and time again. People, and I talked to a police officer, actually as part of the conversation, and a retired police officer said, you wouldn't believe the amount of people that have been wrongly convicted because of cognitive bias, and especially first impressions on the scene, and then that's all a person goes on.